Lily Carter, a young widow rushing home with her 4-month-old daughter burning with fever in her arms, suddenly heard the sound of someone sobbing nearby. She turned and saw an elderly couple huddled together at a lonely bus stop on the edge of Chicago, shivering in the bitter November cold with no one around. Even though she only had $42 left to buy medicine for her baby, Lily quickly stepped toward them, asked what had happened, and a few seconds later, she decided to call the cheapest Uber she could find, guiding the two strangers into the back seat. What she didn't know was that this single choice would expose a devastating truth and change all of their lives forever. And what she couldn't possibly imagine was that from a black Mercedes parked 3 blocks away, one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Chicago was watching her every move because the elderly couple she had just saved were the only people he had ever called family. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The Uber glided through the empty streets of Chicago on a bitter November night. Lily sat in the front seat, holding Emma tight against her chest, now and then lifting a hand to check the baby's forehead. Still hot. She bit her lip with worry, but forced herself to look calm. In the back seat, the elderly couple pressed close together as if they were afraid of being pulled apart. The man introduced himself as Harold, 74 years old. His wife, Margaret, 72. Their voices trembled. Maybe from the cold, maybe from something else entirely. Harold said their son, Kevin, had dropped them off at that bus station 7 hours earlier. He'd said he had an important appointment. Promised he'd be back within an hour. They waited. 1 hour, 2 hours, then 3. Kevin didn't come back. Margaret tried to call, but Harold's phone screen had been cracked since the week before and it no longer worked. And Kevin's number? Neither of them could remember, because it had been saved in the phone, and they'd never once needed to write it down. Lily listened, her heart weighted by a feeling she couldn't quite name. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but the instincts of someone who'd already lost everything whispered that this story wasn't as simple as it looked. Margaret suddenly leaned forward, her gaze settling on Emma asleep in Lily's arms. She asked softly how many months the baby was, and whether she had a fever. Lily nodded and said 4 months, and yes, a mild fever. Margaret clicked her tongue in sympathy, said raising a little one was exhausting, and asked whether Lily's husband helped much. The question landed like a knife on a wound that hadn't finished healing. Lily was silent for a moment, then said, her voice as light as breath, that she was widowed. Margaret didn't ask anything more. She only reached her hand through the gap between the seats, took Lily's hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. Not a word. But sometimes silence is warmer than 1,000 comforts. Harold spoke up, trying to steer the conversation toward something more hopeful. He told her about the new house Kevin had bought for them, number 28 Oakwood Street, in Maple Grove. A small, lovely place with a white fence and a flower garden out front. Kevin had shown them pictures, saying it was the perfect spot for them to live out their later years in peace. They'd only moved in 3 weeks ago. Lily nodded and repeated the address to the driver. The car turned into Maple Grove. The houses on either side of the road lay still in the dark, only the weak yellow streetlights spilling onto the damp, misted pavement. The driver began searching for Oakwood. They passed through once, then twice. The driver frowned, glanced at his phone, then looked outside. He said this was Oakwood Street, but there was no number 28. Harold leaned forward, his voice tightening with fear, insisting there had to be. A pale yellow house with white shutters. The car came to a stop. In front of them was an empty lot. Weeds stood knee-high. A crooked sign leaned in the ground, its letters faded. For sale. There was no house, no white fence, no flower garden. Harold opened the door and stepped out, his legs shaking. He walked a few steps toward the vacant lot, then froze. Margaret called his name, her voice tipping into panic, asking where their home was. Harold turned back, his face washed pale under the streetlight. He stammered that he didn't understand. Kevin had shown him pictures. He had seen the house. Then he collapsed, both hands clutching his head. His voice cracked as he spoke about their old home, the one they had lived in for 40 years in the heart of Chicago. Kevin said it was too old, too big for 2 elderly people. Kevin said he would sell it, take the money and invest it so they could get a better return. Kevin said he'd handle all the paperwork. And they believed him. They signed everything their son put in front of them without asking. Because he was their son. Because how could they not trust him? Margaret began to cry, the strangled sobs of someone who had just lost everything. Lily stepped out of the car and came to the 2 elderly strangers falling apart in the winter night of Chicago. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. But she knew one thing. She couldn't leave them here. She set a hand on Harold's shoulder, her voice gentle but steady, and told them to come home with her tonight. She had a small apartment, but there was room, and in the morning they would find a way forward together. Harold looked up at her, eyes reddened, and asked why she was helping them. They were only strangers. Lily smiled, a sad smile from someone who understood what loss really meant, and said, "Because tonight you need someone, and I'm here. That's all." They got back into the car. Lily gave the driver her address. The Uber turned around and left Maple Grove behind, leaving the empty lot and the for sale sign swaying in the cold wind. Lily didn't know that a few hundred meters away, a black Mercedes was turning around too, following, and the man behind the wheel was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, his eyes never leaving the Uber ahead, not even for a second. Adrian Cross sat in the black Mercedes, his eyes never leaving the elderly couple as the young woman helped them into the Uber. He'd driven through this stretch of Lincoln Park every year in November for 10 years. No one knew why. No one dared ask. People only knew that the head of the Cross Industries empire, the man who made the entire Chicago underworld tremble, grew quieter than usual when this month came around. He would drive alone through old streets, stop at familiar corners, then leave with eyes emptier than when he arrived. But tonight was different. Tonight he saw them, two frail figures hunched at a deserted bus stop, holding each other in the skin, slicing cold of Chicago. The man's face, though time had worn it down, still made Adrian's heart feel as if it had stopped. White silver hair, narrow shoulders, but the way he held his wife, the way he tilted his head when he spoke, it all matched the memory Adrian had fought to keep for 21 years. Harold, the name rang through his mind like a bell. Harold and Margaret Bennett. The past rushed in like floodwater, dragging Adrian back to a rainy night when he was 5. Uncle Richard, his father's younger brother, had led him into a dark alley on the edge of the city. He said they were playing hide and seek, that Adrian should stand there and wait, that Uncle would come back to pick him up. Adrian waited. Rain began to fall. Then it fell harder. Then night came down. A 5-year-old boy stood in that alley, clothes soaked through, shivering so badly his teeth rattled, still believing Uncle would return. But Richard never came back. He needed Adrian to vanish so he could seize the Cross family inheritance, and the easiest way was to let a 5-year-old die of cold in the rain. Adrian couldn't remember when he passed out. He only remembered waking to warmth, lying on a bed, with a man streaked with gray sitting beside him, eyes full of worry. Harold Bennett. He was a carpenter, living with his wife Margaret in a small house in Lincoln Park. That morning he'd walked toward his workshop and found Adrian burning with fever, unconscious in the alley. He carried the boy home, called a doctor, and cared for him like his own son. 10 years. Adrian lived with the Bennetts for 10 years. It was the happiest 10 years of his life. Harold taught him to work wood, taught him how to hold a hammer, how to plane a board, how to shape something beautiful from dead, senseless pieces of timber. Margaret taught him to read, taught him to write, taught him that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever steal. They weren't rich. They didn't have power. But they gave Adrian what the Cross family, with its billions of dollars, never had: unconditional love. Not everyone welcomed Adrian's presence. Kevin, the Bennett's only biological son, hated the boy from the first day. He called Adrian a stray, a freeloader, a nobody no one wanted. Whenever Harold and Margaret weren't looking, Kevin found ways to bully him. But Adrian never told. He didn't want them to suffer over their own son. When Adrian was 15, everything changed. The Cross family finally found him. Adrian's grandfather, the head of the family, uncovered the truth about what Richard had done. He forced Richard to find the abandoned grandson at any cost. And when he discovered Adrian living happily with the Bennetts, he decided to take him back. Adrian didn't want to go. He cried. He begged. He said this was his home. But he had no choice. The Cross family left a large sum of money with Harold and Margaret as thanks, then took Adrian away. The day he left the little house in Lincoln Park, Adrian held Harold and Margaret one last time. He promised, choking on the words, that he'd come back, that he'd repay them. But life inside the Cross family didn't allow him to keep that promise as soon as he wanted. It wasn't until he was 26, when he finally held real power in his hands, that he could return to Lincoln Park. But the small house had been sold. No one knew where the Bennetts had gone. Adrian searched for 10 years. He hired detectives, used every connection, turned all of Chicago upside down. Not a trace. For 10 years he returned to the old neighborhood every November, hoping he might run into them by chance. And for 10 years he left empty-handed. Until tonight. Adrian watched the young woman with the baby as she guided the 2 old people into the Uber. He watched the way she spoke to them, gentle, patient. He watched the way the elderly couple looked at her, with gratitude and trust. He couldn't be sure it was Harold and Margaret. 21 years was too long, but his heart knew. The Uber began to move. Adrian started his engine, keeping just enough distance not to be noticed, but never letting them out of his sight. He lifted his phone and called Nathan Cole, his most trusted right hand. His voice was brief and cold, the way it always was when he gave an order. Investigate immediately. The 2 elderly people at the Lincoln Park bus stop tonight, and the girl who helped them. He needed everything within an hour. Nathan was silent for a moment, then asked, sounding surprised, whether it was that urgent. Adrian watched the Uber turn onto a narrow street, his eyes darkening. He said, his voice rough as if he were holding something back that was about to break loose, that if it really was them, then he'd already lost them for 21 years. He couldn't lose another night. Lily's apartment was on the 4th floor of an old, worn building in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. She unlocked the door, turned on the light, and stepped aside to let Harold and Margaret come in. It was a tiny studio, just one room that served as living room, bedroom, and kitchen all at once. A single bed pressed into the corner, an old sofa faded with age, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and a simple kitchenette with a few cooking tools. Everything was old, but clean and orderly. Lily felt her cheeks burn as she looked at the 2 elderly people standing in the tight space. She apologized in a small voice, saying her place was cramped. There wasn't much. She was sorry she couldn't treat them better. Margaret turned to her, eyes still red from crying, yet lit with warmth. She said this was heaven compared to the bus station tonight, told her not to apologize, told her she had saved 2 old people. Lily moved quickly, making arrangements. She offered them the bed, changed to clean sheets, and pulled extra blankets from the closet. She said she and Emma would sleep on the sofa. It was fine. She slept on it many nights when Emma was fussy. Harold started to object, but Margaret took his hand and gave a soft shake of her head. She understood this was the only way the young woman could help them, and refusing would only make her more uncomfortable. The night deepened. The apartment sank into silence. Lily lay on the sofa with Emma in her arms, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept spinning with everything that had happened. 2 old people abandoned by their own son. A house that didn't exist. 40 years of memories sold away. She couldn't understand how a child could do that to his parents. Around 2 a.m, Emma began to fuss. Lily sat up and quietly nursed her. Streetlight spilled through the window, just enough for her to see Harold sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes turned toward the night outside. He couldn't sleep. Lily hesitated, then softly called to him and asked whether he wanted some tea. Harold turned, his gaze tired but carrying a strained little smile. He said no. He didn't need anything. He just couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what was already done. Lily carried Emma over and sat beside him by the window. They were quiet for a long time, looking down at the empty street below. Then Harold began to talk. His voice was low and slow, as if every word weighed a great deal. He said Kevin had been addicted to gambling for a long time, since he was young. They had given him money again and again, and every time he promised he would change, he would stop gambling. They believed him because he was their only son. How could they not believe? Harold's voice tightened. He said they truly thought he had changed. In the past few years, he hadn't asked for money anymore. He had even offered to help them manage their finances. They were so happy, convinced their son had finally become the man they'd prayed for. And then this. Lily listened, her chest drawing tight. She understood that feeling, the feeling of being betrayed by the person you trusted most. Maybe that was why she started to speak about Daniel. She said her husband died 6 months ago, when a drunk driver slammed into his car as he was on his way home. She was pregnant when the hospital called. By the time she arrived, Daniel was gone, giving birth alone, arranging a funeral alone, facing a mountain of medical bills and burial costs alone. There were nights she stayed awake, holding her pregnant belly, asking herself what reason she had left to live. Then Emma was born, and the first time she looked into her daughter's eyes, she knew she had to live for that baby. The baby was everything she had left of Daniel. Harold listened without a word, his eyes shining with tears. When Lily finished, he reached out and set his hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. He said, his voice trembling, that she was stronger than she thought. Lily looked at him, a 74-year-old man who had lost everything in a single night, and yet was still trying to comfort her. She smiled and told him he was too. They sat together in silence, until the sky began to pale. 2 strangers from 2 different worlds, pulled close by pain. The next morning, Lily hurried to get ready for work. She was a nurse. Her morning shift started at 7 o'clock, She couldn't take time off because she needed money to pay down debt. She was scrambling to figure out how to call a childcare service when Margaret came to her. Gently, Margaret said she would watch Emma. It had been so long since she'd held a baby. She missed that feeling terribly. Lily started to refuse. But when she looked into Margaret's eyes, she saw sincerity and a longing to do something useful. Lily nodded and thanked her. When she closed the apartment door and went down the stairs, she realized something. For the first time in 6 months, she left home without feeling completely alone. Cross Tower rose like a hard silhouette in the heart of Chicago, a 50-story building of glossy black glass catching and throwing back the city's lights. The top floor held Adrian Cross's private office, a place very few people ever had the privilege to enter. That morning, as the sun was only beginning to show itself, Adrian was already seated behind his black oak desk, dark circles under his eyes from a night without sleep. He hadn't gone home. He'd sat here, waiting. Nathan Cole walked in at 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 thick files in his hands. He set them on the desk in front of Adrian without a word. Adrian looked at the files, then slowly opened the first one. Harold and Margaret Bennett. He read page after page, his face blank, but Nathan could see the slight tremor in his fingers. The file confirmed what Adrian's heart had known since the night before. It was them, his people, the two who had pulled him back from death on a rainy night, 31 years ago, and raised him for 10 years. Harold Bennett, 74 years old, a former carpenter, retired for 10 years. Margaret Bennett, 72 years old, a former elementary school teacher. They had lived in their old house in Lincoln Park for 40 years, until 3 weeks ago. The house had been sold. The seller was Kevin Bennett, their only son, holding power of attorney from his parents. Sale price, $380,000. The money was transferred into Kevin's account, and 2 days later, every last dollar had been withdrawn. Kevin Bennett was currently in Las Vegas, owing the Rivera gang $200,000 in gambling debt. He had sold his parents' house to pay what he owed, but it still wasn't enough. He was hiding in a cheap hotel on the outskirts, waiting for what couldn't be avoided. Adrian finished reading and closed the file. He sat in silence for a long time. Then, without warning, he swept his arm and threw the whiskey glass on the desk into the wall. The glass shattered, liquor spraying across a painting worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nathan didn't flinch. He was used to Adrian's anger, but this time something was different. This wasn't the cold, calculated fury Nathan knew so well. This was the rage of a child watching his family get hurt. Adrian spoke through clenched teeth, his voice hissing with contempt, saying that man sold his own parents' house. He took every cent of their 40 years of savings, and then he left them at a bus stop in the middle of a Chicago winter night. Nathan asked, calm as ever, how the boss wanted to deal with Kevin. Adrian didn't answer. His hand tightened into a fist, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to kill Kevin. He wanted to make him pay for what he'd done. But Kevin was their biological son. No matter how cruel he was, they would still suffer if he died. Adrian drew a deep breath, forcing the anger down. He said, his voice dropping, no, he needed to think. Nathan nodded, then slid the second file toward him. Lily Carter. Adrian opened it and read, 27 years old, a nurse at Chicago General Hospital, widowed. Her husband, Daniel Carter, 29 years old, had died in a traffic accident 6 months earlier. The driver who caused it, Thomas Reed, drunk, had been sentenced to 5 years in prison. Lily had been 4 months pregnant when her husband died. She'd given birth alone, handled the funeral alone, faced everything alone. Her current debt was $47,000, including childbirth medical bills and her husband's funeral costs. Monthly income, $3,200, expenses for rent, childcare, food, and minimum debt payments. There was almost nothing left at the end of each month. And last night, she had used her last $42 to call an Uber for 2 elderly strangers. Adrian finished and closed the file. He sat utterly still for a long time, staring into the empty space in front of him. Nathan waited, motionless. Finally, Adrian spoke, and his voice was strange, softer than usual. He said she had nothing at all, buried in debt, and yet she still helped. She gave up her own bed for strangers. She used her last money to get them a ride. Nathan asked what he wanted to do. Adrian stood, walked to the window, and looked down at Chicago waking up beneath him. He said, pay off her debt, arrange a decent apartment for the old couple, and Nathan would do it today. Nathan nodded and started to turn away, but Adrian called him back. He added, his voice slow, as if weighing every word. Don't let her know the money came from him. She wasn't the kind of person who'd accept charity. Nathan looked at his boss for a long moment. 10 years working for Adrian Cross, he'd watched him order killings without blinking, watched him crush an enemy's empire without a second of hesitation. But this was the first time he'd seen Adrian Cross care about anyone beyond himself. Nathan nodded and left the room. Adrian remained by the window, looking down at the city. But his mind was already in some small apartment on the south side, where a young woman had just left for work, leaving her 4-month-old daughter with 2 elderly people she'd met only the night before. 4 days had passed since the fateful night at the bus stop. Lily's tiny apartment began to change in ways she never expected. Margaret had turned the little kitchenette into a place where warm meals appeared, the smell of good food filling the whole room every time Lily came home from work. Harold refused to sit still. He found Daniel's old toolbox in the closet and began fixing the small things around the place. The leaky faucet Lily had endured for 3 months no longer dripped. The crooked cabinet door now opened and closed smoothly. The squeaking door hinge had gone quiet. He did it all without fanfare, as if this was the only way he knew to repay the young woman who had saved them. Emma seemed to feel the change, too. The baby fussed less, slept more peacefully, and smiled more often whenever Margaret held her. Lily watched it all with a strange, warming fullness in her chest. For 6 months she had grown used to being alone, used to coming home to silence, used to facing everything by herself. But now, for the first time in all that time, this little apartment felt like a real home. Late on the 4th day, just as Lily finished her shift and was getting ready to head back, her phone buzzed with a new email. She opened it and froze in the hospital hallway. An email from the bank said her loan of $47,000 had been paid in full. Lily read it again and again, 3 times. Sure, she had to be seeing it wrong. She called the bank immediately, her voice shaking as she asked what mistake this was. The bank representative confirmed there was no mistake. An anonymous benefactor had paid off her entire debt this morning. Lily ended the call, her thoughts spinning. $47,000. The amount she had expected to fight through for at least 10 years. Who? Why? She rushed home, and the moment she stepped into the apartment, she saw a stranger sitting and speaking with Harold and Margaret. He looked about 34, wearing a gray suit, polite in his manner, yet there was something sharp in his eyes. He stood when he saw Lily, introduced himself as Nathan Cole, and said he represented someone who wanted to help the Bennetts. Nathan explained that the person he represented had prepared a 2-bedroom apartment in a better area for the couple, completely free, along with all living expenses. And as for Lily's debt, that had come from the same person. Lily looked at Nathan, then at Harold and Margaret, then back at Nathan. She asked, her voice tightening, who that person was. Nathan smiled politely and said the person wished to keep his identity private. Lily shook her head. She said plainly she didn't know him. She didn't know who was behind this, and she wouldn't take money from strangers. Nathan seemed surprised. He said this was her debt being paid. She didn't need to repay it. Lily cut him off, her voice harder now, saying she would pay it back, every last cent. She didn't need anyone's pity. Nathan fell silent, studying her for a long moment. He had worked for Adrian Cross for 10 years, had watched countless people bow before the money and power of his boss. No one had ever refused, not a single one, until this young woman, standing in front of him with determined eyes and her chin lifted, turning down $47,000 as if it were an insult. Margaret rose and gently laid a hand on Lily's arm. She said, her voice trembling, "Sweetheart, that person could be Adrian." Lily turned to her and asked who Adrian was. Margaret sat back down and pulled Lily to sit beside her. She told her about the 5-year-old child they had found in a dark alley 21 years ago. She told her about raising that boy for 10 years as if he were their own. She told her about the day the Cross family came to take him, and the promise he made that he'd return, that he'd repay them. She said if it really was Adrian, then this wasn't charity, this was family. Lily listened, but she still shook her head. She said she understood, but whoever it was, she needed to meet him directly. She needed to look him in the eye and know why. She wouldn't take money from the dark. Nathan nodded and said he would pass along the message. He stood, said goodbye to the Bennetts and to Lily, and left the apartment. Stepping into the elevator, Nathan pulled out his phone and called Adrian. He reported briefly that she refused, and that she wanted to meet the boss in person. On the other end, there was silence for a long moment. Then Adrian's voice came through, not angry the way Nathan expected, but carrying something that sounded almost like amusement. Adrian said it was interesting, very interesting. Nathan ended the call and stared at his phone screen in disbelief. In 10 years working for Adrian Cross, he had never heard his boss's voice like that. And on the 50th floor of Cross Tower, Adrian stood by the window looking down at the city. the corner of his mouth lifting into a small smile. For the first time in many years, the new apartment sat in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Chicago, near Lincoln Park, not far from where the Bennetts had lived for 40 years. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a fully equipped kitchen, and a small balcony that looked out over rows of lush green trees. Margaret cried the moment she stepped inside. She stood in the middle of the living room, looking around, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. She wasn't crying because the place was beautiful. She was crying because after so many years, the boy she had once sheltered still remembered them. Lily helped them clean and arrange what little there was, though there truly wasn't much to move. All they had were the clothes on their backs and a few small things Lily had bought for them over the past few days. Lily still carried doubt in her chest. She had agreed to meet the person behind all of this, but that didn't mean she trusted him. $47,000 wasn't a small amount. This apartment had to cost far more. No one gave anything for nothing in this world. There had to be a reason. A knock came at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lily was helping Margaret hang curtains. She set the fabric down and went to open the door. She froze. A tall man stood in front of her, probably over 1.80 meters, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that fit close over a powerful frame. His face was angular and cold as stone, sharp as if carved from ice. But his eyes were different. His eyes were looking over Lily's shoulder into the living room, and they were trembling. Before Lily could speak, Margaret rose from the sofa. She stared at the man in the doorway, and it felt as if the whole world stopped. Adrian. The name came out of her like a whisper, shaking, as if she didn't dare believe her own sight. Adrian, my boy. The man nodded. He couldn't speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. His eyes reddened, and Lily saw something she never thought she would see in a man like him. Tears. Margaret ran to him. So fast, Lily was startled that a 72-year-old woman could move like that. She threw her arms around Adrian, and her sobbing broke open in the room. She cried hard, both arms locked around him, as if he might vanish if she let go. Adrian stood rigid for a moment, then slowly lifted his arms and held her back. His shoulders began to shake. He was crying. The boss of the Cross Empire, the man who made the whole Chicago underworld tremble, stood in this apartment and cried like a child. Harold rose and came forward, slow and careful. He placed his hand on Adrian's shoulder and squeezed. His voice was low and warm, trembling slightly but steady all the same. He said, "My son, you've finally come home." Adrian dropped to his knees. Right there in the living room, in front of Lily, he knelt and pulled the 2 elderly people who had saved his life 31 years ago into his arms. His voice broke, ragged and shattered, with none of the coldness or power left in it. He said he was sorry. He had searched for them for so long. He had looked everywhere. 10 years he searched and couldn't find them. He was sorry he had let them suffer. Margaret stroked his hair the way she used to when he was a 5-year-old boy afraid of thunder, crawling into their bed in the middle of a rainy night. She whispered that him being back was enough. It was all right. Him being back was enough. They held each other like that for a long time. Lily stood in the corner holding Emma, not knowing whether she should go or stay. She felt as if she were intruding on something too private, too sacred, but she couldn't look away. She watched the most powerful man in Chicago on his knees, crying like a child, and she understood she was seeing something very few people ever got to see. The real human being inside Adrian Cross. At last Adrian stood. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to gather himself, but he didn't quite manage it. His eyes were still red when he turned to Lily. He said, his voice still rough, that she was Lily Carter, and she had wanted to meet him to ask why. Lily nodded and said yes. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, then at the Bennetts, then back to her. He said, slow and sincere, because they were his family. They were the only people who had ever loved him without conditions, and she had saved them when he wasn't there. He owed her. He owed her more than anything he could repay. Lily stayed quiet. She searched the man's eyes, looking for deceit, for calculation. But she saw only honesty, and pain, and gratitude. Margaret took Lily's hand and pulled her closer. She said this was Adrian, the son she had told Lily about, the child they had found on a rainy night 31 years ago. Then she turned to Adrian and said, "And this is Lily, the girl who saved us when there was no one else." Harold nodded, his voice warm, and said that both of them were their children. Lily looked at Harold, then Margaret, then Adrian. She saw him watching her with a strange look, as if he were trying to understand what kind of person she truly was. She didn't know how she was supposed to respond. She only knew that in this moment, watching the powerful man kneeling beside the 2 elderly people, she understood one thing. Whoever he was, However dangerous his world might be, in this moment, he was only an abandoned child who had finally found the road back home. That night, after Emma had fallen into a deep sleep, Lily sat on the old sofa in her small apartment, the glow of her phone, the only light in the dark. She typed 3 words into the search bar: Adrian Cross Chicago, and hit enter. The results came fast and endless. CEO of Cross Industries, the Cross Empire and its secrets, Chicago's new kingpin, the youngest billionaire in the city, or the ruler of the underworld. Lily read article after article, her heartbeat quickening. None of them said it outright, but the hints were sharp enough to cut. Weapons trafficking, money laundering, competitors who vanished without a trace, cases that were never solved, police who didn't dare touch him, politicians who dodged the question whenever his name was mentioned. Adrian Cross wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was Mafia. Lily shut off her phone and stared up at the ceiling in the darkness. She thought of the man who had dropped to his knees and cried like a child in front of the Bennetts. She thought of his eyes when he looked at her, honest and grateful. And she thought of what she had just read. The 2 pictures didn't fit together. Or maybe, she told herself, both were true. The next morning at the hospital, Rachel pulled Lily into the staff break room. Her coworker looked at her with worry and asked bluntly whether Lily had lost her mind. Adrian Cross. Everybody knew he was Mafia. You're getting tangled up with the most dangerous man in Chicago. Lily let out a long breath and said he had helped the old couple she knew. Rachel shook her head, her voice serious, saying Mafia men could be good to their own. But you're not his own. You're an outsider. And outsiders in their world usually don't get happy endings. Lily went quiet for a moment, then said she knew. She would be careful. That afternoon, Nathan called. Adrian wanted to see Lily, alone. She meant to refuse, but then she reconsidered. She needed to know more about this man. She needed to understand who he really was before deciding whether she should let the Bennetts continue accepting his help. The cafe sat on the top floor of a luxurious building, looking out over the whole sweep of Chicago. When Lily walked in, she realized the entire floor was empty. No other customers, only Adrian at a table by the window, and a few men in black suits spaced out like statues. Lily carried Emma over and sat across from him. She had no one to watch Emma, and she didn't want her baby far from her when meeting a man like him. Adrian looked at Emma, and Lily saw his expression soften in a way that startled her. He asked how many months the baby was, his voice gentler than usual. Lily answered 4 months, then fell silent. She wasn't here for small talk. Adrian understood. He leaned back and waited. Lily spoke plainly, calm but firm, saying she had looked into him. Adrian asked what she found, not a trace of surprise in his voice. Lily said, "Things that should make me not be sitting here." Adrian was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said, low and direct, that he wasn't a good man, Miss Carter. He had done many things the law would never forgive. The articles she read weren't wrong, and they might not even have told the full truth about what he'd done. Lily asked why he was telling her the truth. Adrian held her gaze without flinching. He said because she had saved the people he loved most, and he owed her honesty. He didn't want to begin anything with her through a lie. Lily didn't know what to do with that kind of bluntness. She stayed silent, holding Emma closer. Then Adrian leaned forward, lowering his voice. He said he knew about her husband, about Daniel, about the crash 6 months ago. He knew the name of the drunk driver who killed him, Thomas Reed, and he knew the man had only been sentenced to 5 years. Lily went still. She hadn't expected him to know that much. Adrian continued, his voice steady and quiet, saying he could make sure Thomas Reed never got out of prison. Or worse, if she wanted. Lily looked at him, and for a moment she wanted to say yes. She wanted the man who took her husband to pay. She wanted revenge. The feeling came so strong it frightened her. But then she looked down at Emma asleep in her arms. She thought of Daniel, of his gentle smile, of the way he always believed there was good in people. Daniel wouldn't want her to become someone who gave orders to kill. Daniel wouldn't want their daughter to grow up with a mother like that. Lily shook her head. She said, softly but with certainty, "No, Daniel wouldn't want that, and neither would she." Adrian watched her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Lily stood, Emma in her arms. She said, calm and clear, "Mr. Cross, I don't need you to take revenge for me. I only need you to keep them safe. That's all I need." She turned and walked away without looking back. Adrian stayed seated, watching the young woman carrying her small child as she left the cafe. And on the face of the coldest Mafia boss in Chicago, there appeared something no one had ever seen before: admiration. A week after the meeting at the cafe, Nathan walked into Adrian's office with the latest report on Kevin Bennett. Adrian read in silence, his face giving nothing away, but his eyes darkening by degrees. Kevin was in Las Vegas. He had gambled away every last bit of the $380,000 from selling his parents' house. Not a cent left. Worse, he now owed the Rivera gang $200,000 more in gambling debt. Nathan added, in the same even tone, that the Rivera gang wasn't known for patience. They would kill Kevin within a few days if he couldn't pay. Adrian closed the file and stared out the window. He could let Kevin die. That would be the simplest path. Kevin deserved it. But the Bennetts would suffer. No matter how cruel Kevin had been, he was still their biological son. They would never forgive themselves if he died, and they had done nothing. Adrian didn't want to save Kevin from his debt, either. Kevin had to live with the consequences of what he'd done. Adrian made his decision. He would pay the Rivera gang so they would release Kevin, but Kevin would never know. After that, Adrian would bring Kevin back to Chicago to face his parents and the law. Adrian already had all the evidence prepared for Kevin's fraud and embezzlement. Kevin would go to prison. That was justice. 3 days later, 2 of Adrian's men brought Kevin to the Bennett's new apartment. Lily was there too, helping Margaret cook dinner when the door opened. Kevin looked ruined. Hollow, thin, dark circles under his eyes, patchy stubble, wrinkled clothes. He stood in the doorway, looking at the apartment, looking at his parents, and his legs buckled. He dropped to his knees on the floor and began to sob, his voice breaking as he begged for forgiveness over and over. I'm sorry. Mom and Dad, I'm sorry. Margaret froze, both hands trembling as she covered her mouth. She looked at the son she had carried and raised for 45 years, now on his knees in front of her like a beggar. Tears poured down her face as she asked, choking on the words, Why? Why would you do this to us? Kevin gulped for air between sobs and said he owed money. He owed so much. They threatened to kill him. He was terrified. He didn't know what else to do. Harold stood as still as stone. He looked at Kevin, his face turned to something hard and unreadable, without a single expression. But his eyes were different. His eyes held a kind of pain language couldn't contain. At last he spoke, his voice low and shaking, each word forced up as if dragged from his throat. He said, You took everything from us. The house of 40 years, the savings of a lifetime, everything we had. He stopped and drew a deep breath. His voice shook harder when he continued, saying, But the worst pain isn't the money. The worst pain is that you took our trust. You made it so we can't even trust our own son anymore. Harold stared into Kevin's eyes and said words he had never imagined saying to the child of his blood. You're not my son anymore. Kevin crumpled, crying like a child. Margaret cried too, and she wanted to run to him, but her legs wouldn't move. Lily stood at the edge of the kitchen, holding Emma tight, watching it all. She saw Harold turn away, his shoulders trembling, and she knew he was crying even though he didn't want anyone to see. She went to him, her voice gentle. She said, Mister, Harold, I understand you're angry. Harold turned on her, his eyes red, his voice almost a shout, saying, You don't understand. Lily didn't step back. She met his gaze, her voice still calm but steady, and said she did understand, because she had been betrayed by family too. She knew what it felt like. She paused, then said he shouldn't speak words he couldn't take back. Not because Kevin deserved forgiveness, but because Harold and Margaret didn't deserve to carry hatred for the rest of their lives. Harold looked at her, then at Kevin, then at Margaret. He said nothing more, only turned and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. The doorbell rang. The police had arrived. Adrian stood in one corner of the room, watching everything in silence. He nodded to the 2 officers, and they stepped forward to put Kevin in handcuffs. The charge was fraud and embezzlement. The expected sentence was 5 to 7 years in prison. Kevin didn't resist. He let them cuff him, let them read him his rights, his eyes still fixed on Margaret as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find any words. Margaret stood there watching her son being led away, and when the door closed, her legs gave out. Lily caught her before she fell. She guided her to the sofa, eased her down, got her water, and rubbed her back the way you soothe a child. Adrian stayed in the corner, watching Lily. He watched the way she stayed calm inside the chaos, the way she cared for the Bennetts as if they were her own parents. She didn't panic. She didn't run. She stayed and did what had to be done. Adrian realized something. She had become an irreplaceable part of the Bennett's life. No one had asked her to do it. She chose it. And a question surfaced in his mind. A question he never expected to ask. Could she become a part of his life too? 2 months had passed since the day Kevin was arrested. Life slowly settled into a steadiness no one had expected. The Bennets grew used to the new apartment. Harold started tending a few small pots of plants on the balcony, and Margaret often cooked the dishes she remembered from her younger days. Lily still stopped by every day after her shift. Emma strapped against her in a worn cloth carrier. The baby was 6 months old now, beginning to babble and reach for familiar faces. Emma began to direct her first sweet babbles toward Harold and Margaret. Those simple, bubbling sounds were enough to make the two old people cry with happiness. Adrian came often, too. At first, he said it was to visit them, and maybe at first that was true, but little by little Lily noticed he came more and more, stayed longer, and his gaze rested on her longer than it needed to. One afternoon, Adrian arrived just as Emma was wailing. Lily was busy in the kitchen cooking rice, her hands covered in flour, unable to pick the baby up. Margaret was in the bathroom. Harold looked at Adrian, then at Emma, crying in the chair, then back at Adrian with a knowing look. Adrian stood there, awkward in a way he had never been with anyone. The most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, a man who had given orders to kill without blinking, now frozen in front of a 6-month-old baby screaming her heart out. Finally, he bent down and carefully lifted Emma, clumsy as someone who had never held a child before. And something strange happened. Emma stopped crying. She stared at him with wide, curious eyes, then reached up with her tiny hand and touched his face. Margaret came out of the bathroom, saw the scene, and laughed. She said the baby liked him, Adrian. Adrian looked down at Emma, and Lily saw his cold face soften in a way she had never seen before. The following week, Lily caught a cold. She still forced herself to visit the Bennets as usual, even with a red nose and a raw, hoarse voice. She had barely sat down on the sofa when the door opened. Adrian walked in with a paper bag in his hand. He set it on the table. Inside were cold medicine and a box of hot porridge. Lily started to say she didn't need it, but Adrian cut her off. He spoke in an even tone, as if he were talking about business, saying if she was sick, then who would take care of the Bennets? Who would take care of Emma? This wasn't him helping her. This was him helping himself. Lily looked at him, then at the bag, then back at him. And for the first time since she had met Adrian Cross, she smiled at him. A real smile, not forced, not guarded. Adrian stood there, and he didn't understand why a small smile like that made his chest feel strangely warm. On another evening, while they were all eating dinner together, Harold suddenly began talking about Adrian as a child. He said, with a voice full of love, that the boy had been terrified of thunder. Every time a hard rain came with lightning, he would crawl into their bed, curling between them like a little kitten. Adrian's face went red, something Lily didn't think was possible for a man like him. He said, awkwardly, that Harold should stop telling those stories. But Harold didn't stop. He went on about how little Adrian used to cry because he was afraid of the dark, about how he would hide behind Margaret whenever strangers came to the house, about the time he fell out of an apple tree and cried, "Grandma," for a full hour. Lily laughed. The sound came out naturally, impossible to hold back. It was the first real laugh she had given since Daniel died. Adrian watched her laugh and felt something sharp and strange in his chest. He didn't understand the feeling. He only knew he wanted to hear that laughter again. That night, when Lily was getting ready to leave, Adrian offered to drive her and Emma home. Lily refused, polite but firm, saying she could get herself home. She had been getting herself home for 6 months. She didn't need anyone to drive her. She carried Emma out the door, down the elevator, out of the building. Adrian stood by the window watching. He saw her climb into her old car, start the engine, and drive away. And even though she had refused, Adrian still took his keys, went down to the parking garage, and drove after her. He kept far enough back that she wouldn't notice, but close enough to step in if anything happened. He didn't know why he was doing it. He only knew that if something happened to her on the way home, he would never forgive himself. Victoria Ashford was 32 years old, beautiful like a painting and dangerous like a venomous snake. She was the only daughter of Richard Ashford, Cross Industries' biggest business partner, the man who held 30% of the shares in the empire Adrian was running. Victoria had set her sights on Adrian years ago, not out of love, but out of power. Marrying Adrian Cross would mean becoming the queen of Chicago's underworld, with money, status, and everything she craved. Her father, Richard Ashford, was also pressuring Adrian to marry Victoria to solidify the alliance between the two families. It would be a political marriage, with no love, only advantage, and Victoria accepted that completely, until she discovered Lily Carter. Victoria's private investigator reported that Adrian was frequently visiting an apartment on the north side of Chicago, where an elderly couple lived with a young nurse and her small child. Adrian went there almost every day, stayed for hours, and seemed deeply attentive to that nurse. Victoria was furious. No one was allowed to stand in her way. No one. She decided to handle the problem herself. That afternoon, Victoria appeared at Chicago General Hospital right as Lily's shift ended. She stood waiting in the hallway, wearing a designer dress worth thousands of dollars, striking among nurses and patients dressed in ordinary clothes. When Lily came out, Victoria stepped forward, a smile on her lips but eyes cold as ice. She asked, in a sweet voice that rang false, whether Lily was Lily Carter. She had heard Lily was close to Adrian Cross. Lily stopped, alert at once. She answered, calm, that she was only someone who knew the elderly couple Adrian supported, nothing more. Victoria laughed, a sound without warmth. She said the old couple. How adorable. But Lily should know Adrian, and she were about to get engaged. Lily looked at Victoria, then replied gently that if they were about to be engaged, then who Adrian knew wasn't Victoria's problem. Lily added that she had no intentions toward Adrian Cross. But whether she did or didn't, it still wasn't Victoria's business. Victoria went still. She wasn't used to being answered that way, especially not by a poor nurse with nothing to her name. Others would have trembled at the Ashford name, would have bowed, apologized, and vanished. But this girl didn't. Victoria stepped closer, leaned in near Lily's ear, her voice dropping into a threat. She said Lily didn't know who she was, didn't know what she could do, and she advised Lily to stay away from Adrian unless she wanted regrets. Lily didn't move back. She looked straight into Victoria's eyes, her voice strangely steady. She said she was a widow, raising a child alone. She had once been $47,000 in debt, and she asked what Victoria thought she could take from Lily, that Lily hadn't already lost. She had lost her husband. She had lost her future. She had lost everything except her little daughter. What was she supposed to be afraid of now? Victoria fell silent. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say to someone who wasn't afraid of her. She turned away and walked quickly toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply across the hospital floor. Lily stood and watched her go, her heart racing, her face still holding itself steady. She knew she had just made an enemy of a dangerous woman, but she didn't regret it. Victoria climbed into the luxury car waiting outside, shut the door, and pulled out her phone. She called her brother James, her voice cold as steel. She ordered him to find out everything about Lily Carter. Weaknesses, family, work schedule, all of it. Victoria looked into the rearview mirror and adjusted her perfect hair, her eyes like ice. She whispered to herself that the nurse wanted to play. Fine. Then she would show that nurse what real play looked like. A month later, the peace was threatened when Nathan reported to Adrian about the encounter between Victoria and Lily. Adrian listened, and his face went cold as stone. He summoned Victoria to his office that same afternoon. Victoria walked in, confident as always, but her smile died when she met Adrian's eyes. He didn't invite her to sit. He only said, his voice ice cold, that if she touched Lily Carter or the Bennetts, he would destroy everything her father had built for 40 years. He wasn't threatening. He was promising. Victoria went pale. She asked, unable to believe it, whether Adrian was choosing a poor widow over her. Adrian only said 2 words, "Get out." Victoria left with hatred burning in her eyes, but she knew she couldn't do anything. Not yet. That evening, Adrian went to the Bennetts' apartment as usual. They ate dinner together, laughed and talked, and when the Bennetts had gone to bed, Adrian and Lily stayed out on the small balcony looking over Chicago glittering with lights. Emma was asleep in the bedroom, her steady breathing drifting through the door left slightly open. They sat in silence for a long time. No one spoke, only the soft night wind and the distant hum of traffic below. Then Adrian spoke, his voice low and faintly unsteady. Nothing like the cold, powerful tone everyone knew. He said, "Lily, I need to tell you something." Lily turned to him and waited. Adrian drew a deep breath. He said, haltingly, that he liked her. Then he stopped and shook his head. No, not liked. He loved her. Lily went still. She couldn't speak, only stared at him with wide eyes. Adrian went on, more sincere than Lily had ever heard him, saying she made him want to become a better man. For the first time in his life, he wanted that. For the first time, he felt his life could mean more than money and power. Lily closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was something painful in her gaze. She said, softly but firmly, "Adrian." They couldn't. Adrian asked why. Not angry, only needing to understand. Lily looked toward the room where Emma slept. She said because of Emma, the baby needed stability, needed a normal life, not guards following them, not enemies watching, not midnight phone calls or threats like the one from Victoria. Adrian said he could protect her, protect Emma. He had enough power to keep them safe. Lily shook her head. She said that was exactly the problem. She didn't want to need protection. She wanted peace. She wanted Emma to grow up without having to fear anything. Adrian fell silent. He looked at Lily for a long time, then nodded slowly. He didn't get angry. He didn't force her. He only said, his voice low and sad, that he understood. But she should know that whoever she chose, however she decided, he would still be here, because she was someone his parents loved, and he would always protect what they loved. He stood, went back inside, and didn't look back at her. Lily sat alone on the balcony, staring up at a Chicago night sky with no stars. She had said no. She had refused for Emma, for safety, for all the right reasons. Then why did her chest ache like this? Why did her eyes burn? Why did she want to call him back? 2 weeks passed after that night on the balcony. Adrian kept his distance the way Lily wanted. He didn't come to the Bennetts' apartment as often as before, only stopping by when he knew for certain Lily wasn't there. But he still had Nathan quietly watch her from a distance, making sure she was safe without her knowing it. It was the only way he could protect her when she didn't want him by her side. Victoria stayed silent through those 2 weeks. She didn't appear, didn't threaten, didn't do anything at all, and that silence was more frightening than any threat could have been. That night, Lily finished her shift at 11 o'clock. The hospital was nearly empty, the hallway so quiet that only her footsteps echoed back to her. Emma was with the Bennetts tonight because Lily had to work the night shift. Lily walked out to the parking lot behind the hospital where her old car was waiting. She didn't know that Nathan had been pulled away by Victoria's people, distracted by a staged accident a few blocks away. She also didn't know that 3 men were waiting for her in the dark. They stepped out from behind parked cars, black masks covering their faces. One of them spoke, his voice flat and cold, asking if she was Lily Carter, and telling her to come with them. Lily didn't scream. She knew screaming was useless because the lot was empty, not a soul in sight. Instead, she tried to fight her way out. When one man moved in close, she drove her foot hard into his leg, then turned and raked her nails across the face of the second. He cried out in pain, blood running from the scratches on his cheek. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong. The third grabbed her hair from behind and yanked her head back. She felt the bite of a needle against her neck, and everything sank into darkness. When Lily woke up, she was sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of an abandoned warehouse. Her hands were tied tight behind her back, rope cutting into her skin until it burned. The air was damp and cold, heavy with mildew. The only light came from a weak bare bulb hanging above her. Footsteps sounded. A man stepped into the circle of light. He looked about 38, tall, wearing a gray suit, handsome in a hard way, but with eyes sharp as blades. James Ashford, Victoria's brother. He studied Lily with a satisfied smile and asked if she knew why she was here. Lily swallowed her fear and forced her voice to stay steady. She said it was because of Adrian Cross. James laughed and said she was smart, then explained that she would be the card used to make Adrian pay for humiliating the Ashford family. Lily held his gaze and said they thought Adrian would come save her, but they didn't have any relationship. She had already refused him. James laughed louder and told her not to put on an act. They knew everything. They knew how Adrian looked at her, and whether she refused him or not, Adrian Cross would still come to save her. Lily fell silent. In her mind, she prayed that Emma was safe with the Bennetts, that the baby knew nothing, that she was sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms. Lily had to live to get back to her child. Somewhere else in the city, Nathan called Adrian at midnight, his voice shaking. He reported that Lily had been taken, Ashford's network. He'd been distracted, and when he got back, she was gone. Adrian rose from his chair in his office, his face cold as stone, but his hands were trembling. He asked where they were. Nathan said an old warehouse on the far south side. He had confirmed the location. Adrian said to get people ready, but Nathan cut in, anxious, saying they'd warned him that if the boss brought men, they would kill her. Silence held for a few seconds. Then Adrian said, his voice low and even, that in that case he'd go alone. Nathan tried to protest, but Adrian had already ended the call. In the dark warehouse, Lily looked around for an opening. She saw a shard of broken glass near the chair legs, maybe left from a window smashed long ago. Slowly, carefully, she began rubbing the rope against the glass, patient and quiet so she wouldn't make a sound. The fibers started to fray. She didn't know if Adrian would come. She didn't know if he still cared after she had said no. But she wasn't going to sit here and wait to die. She was Emma's mother. She had to live. 30 minutes passed in the dark warehouse. Lily patiently worked the rope against the shard of broken glass, bit by bit, careful not to make a sound. Her hands burned, blood seeping from cuts, the glass carved into her skin. But she didn't stop. At last the rope gave way. Lily kept her hands behind her back, pretending she was still tied. She studied the space around her. 2 guards stood near the main entrance, and James Ashford was gone somewhere, probably outside making a call. This was her chance. One of the guards walked over to check on her. He bent down, looking at Lily, and asked if she wanted water, his voice mocking. Lily didn't answer. She waited until he was close enough, then snapped her arm up, driving the shard straight into his face. He screamed, both hands flying to his face, blood pouring through his fingers. Lily sprang up and ran. She ran toward the door, her heart pounding like a wild thing inside her ribs. The other guard chased her, but she was faster. She was almost there, almost out. Then she stopped as if nailed to the floor. James Ashford stood in front of her, blocking the exit, a gun in his hand aimed straight at her chest. He smiled, his voice cold, and asked where she was going in such a hurry. "Miss Carter." Lily stood still, her heart hammering, but she forced her face to stay calm. She knew if she ran, he would shoot. She had no choice. James stepped closer. The gun still trained on her, the smug smile still there. He said she was brave, but it was useless. No one could save her. At that moment, the back door blew open with a thunderous crash. Adrian walked in, alone, no weapon in his hands. He stared straight at James, eyes like ice, his voice low and deadly, telling him to let her go. James swung the gun toward Adrian and laughed, asking if he had come alone. Was he insane? Adrian didn't answer. He only kept walking forward, each step slow but threatening. He said, in a steady voice, that he only needed himself to handle men like James. The 2 guards rushed him. Adrian moved like lightning. He had been trained since childhood in the Cross family, taught to fight before he was taught to read. He dropped the first man with a punch to the throat, dropped the second with a kick to the knee, and then an elbow to the temple. Both hit the ground within seconds. James panicked and pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded through the warehouse. Adrian shifted aside, but not fast enough. The bullet grazed his shoulder, blood spraying out, but he didn't stop. He surged toward James. Lily didn't think. She acted. She grabbed a rusted metal bar lying nearby and rushed up behind James. Before he could fire a second shot, Lily slammed the bar into his gun hand with every bit of strength she had. James screamed, the gun clattering to the floor. Adrian was on him in an instant, a punch like a hammer cracking into James's face and sending him down hard, unconscious. The warehouse fell silent. Adrian turned to Lily, blood running from his shoulder down his arm, but he didn't seem to care about the wound. He asked, his voice tight with worry, whether she was all right. Lily stood there, still gripping the metal bar, her whole body shaking, but she didn't cry. She said, her voice trembling but stubborn, that she had gotten herself untied. She had almost made it out. Adrian looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. A real smile, not cold, not distant. He said he knew. He had seen her. She was brave. The main doors burst open. Nathan and Adrian's men rushed in, surrounding the remaining attackers, cuffing James and his people. But Lily didn't see anything except Adrian. She let the bar drop, and her legs gave out. Adrian caught her and pulled her against him. And then Lily finally cried. She sobbed hard in his arms, all the fear she had held inside all night breaking open at last. She asked, choking on the words, why he had come. She had told him no. Adrian held her tighter, his voice low and warm, saying that no matter how many times she said no, he couldn't allow her to be hurt. That was something he could never accept. Lily lifted her face to him, tears still sliding down her cheeks, and in that moment she realized what she had denied for so long. She loved him. She had loved him for a long time, and tonight, when she thought she might die, the only thing she regretted was not saying it out loud. Nathan brought them to Chicago General Hospital, where Lily worked. She insisted on dressing Adrian's wound herself instead of letting the on-call doctor do it. She said this was her hospital. She knew what she was doing. No one dared argue. Adrian sat on the hospital bed and removed his suit jacket and shirt, exposing the injury on his shoulder. The bullet had only grazed him. It hadn't lodged inside, but it still left a long, deep tear. Lily stood beside him with medical tools in hand and began cleaning the wound. Her hands trembled slightly. She tried to focus on the task, but she could feel Adrian's eyes on her, not on the wound, but on her. The room was quiet, broken only by the soft clink of instruments and the sound of their breathing. Then Lily spoke, her voice light and a little unsteady. She said, "You know, the first time I met you, I was so afraid of you," Adrian asked, and now, his voice low and warm. Lily stopped, looking down at the half-bandaged wound. She said now, and then she paused, drew a deep breath, and continued. Now, I'm afraid of losing you. Adrian looked up at her, his eyes widening a fraction, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. Lily set the tools down and met his gaze. She said she had been wrong. She thought staying away from him was protecting Emma, giving the baby a normal life. But tonight, when she thought she might die, the only thing she regretted was not telling him that she stopped, her throat tightening. Adrian asked what, his voice turning rough. Lily looked at him, her eyes blurred with tears. She said she loved him too. Adrian didn't speak. He only rose from the bed and stepped close. He lifted his hand and gently cupped her cheek, his finger wiping away the tear sliding down. Then he bent and kissed her. The kiss was soft, careful, as if he was afraid she might break if he used more force. The kiss of a man who had waited for this moment for so long and still couldn't believe it was real. When they pulled apart, Lily's eyes were still closed, her forehead resting against his. She whispered that he had to promise her one thing. Adrian asked what it was. Lily opened her eyes and looked straight into his, her voice serious. She said change, one step at a time. She didn't need him perfect. She didn't need him to give up everything in a single day. She only needed him to try to become better. For her, for Emma, for himself. Adrian looked into her eyes, and she saw there was no longer the coldness of a Mafia boss there, only a man in love. He said, with certainty, that for her, he would do anything. The next morning they went to the Bennetts' apartment to share the news. Emma was asleep in Margaret's arms when they walked in. Margaret looked up, saw Adrian and Lily standing side by side, hand in hand, and she understood at once. Tears spilled down her face, but they were happy tears, she said, her voice thick, that she knew it. She knew from the first time she saw the way they looked at each other. Harold stood and came to Adrian. He placed his hand on the shoulder of the young man he had saved 31 years earlier and looked him in the eye. He said Adrian had found someone worthy, and he mustn't lose her the way he had almost lost the Bennetts. Adrian took Harold's hand and gripped it tight. He said, firm and steady, that he never would, sir. A year had passed since the night in the warehouse. A year of change, of trials, of promises kept all the way through. Adrian began legalizing cross-industries step by step. He pulled back from the underworld, cut off the illegal deals, shifted the empire into legitimate business. It wasn't easy. Many enemies pushed back. Many old partners turned their backs. And there were nights he faced, threats he never told Lily about. But he kept his word. Every day he tried to become better. For her, for Emma, for the family he was building. Lily stayed a nurse at Chicago General Hospital. Adrian offered more than once for her to stop working, telling her she didn't have to struggle anymore. He could take care of her and Emma. But Lily refused. She said she loved her work. She liked helping people, and she didn't want to become dependent on anyone, not even the man she loved. Adrian respected that. Emma was 1.5 now, toddling on unsteady legs and babbling her first words. She called Adrian Dad. The first time he heard it, Adrian went still in the Bennetts' living room, his eyes shining red. He lifted her, held her tight against his chest, and whispered that Dad was here. Dad would always be here. Every Sunday the whole family came to the Bennetts' apartment for dinner. Margaret cooked traditional dishes. Harold told old stories. Emma ran in little hops from room to room, and Lily sat beside Adrian with her head on his shoulder. Those were the most peaceful moments Adrian had ever known. One November afternoon, exactly a year after the night that changed everything at the bus stop, Adrian took Lily to Lincoln Park. She didn't know why he wanted to come here, but she followed without asking. They stopped at the old bus stop, the one where Lily had found Harold and Margaret trembling in the winter night a year ago, where it all began. Adrian turned to Lily, then suddenly dropped to one knee on the cold sidewalk. Lily froze, her hand over her mouth, no words coming. Adrian reached into his coat and pulled out a small black velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a simple diamond ring, bright with light. He looked up at her, his eyes blurred with tears, his voice shaking as he began. He said that a year ago, in this very place, she had saved the 2 people he loved most. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know who he was. She only knew they needed help, and she helped, when she had nothing but her heart. He stopped and drew a deep breath. Then he said, "Lily Carter, you saved my family. You saved me. Will you give me the chance to spend my whole life beside you?" Lily cried. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she was smiling. She nodded and said yes. "Yes, Adrian." She accepted. Adrian stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into his arms. They stood there holding each other beside the quiet bus stop, in a cold November afternoon that somehow felt warmer than anything they had ever known. A few yards away, Margaret and Harold were watching. Adrian had secretly invited them to witness the moment. Margaret sobbed, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. Harold smiled, for the first time since the day Kevin was arrested. A smile that was truly happy. He said softly that at last, their family was whole. The wedding was held on a late spring day, in a small church in the suburbs outside Chicago. There were no hundreds of guests like the weddings of the upper class. No reporters, no cameras, only the Bennetts, Nathan, Rachel, and a few of the closest people. That was all Lily and Adrian needed. Lily wore a simple white dress. No heavy stones or elaborate lace, just soft silk falling gently around her. Adrian had offered to buy her any dress she wanted, from the most famous designers in the world, but she refused. She said she didn't need an expensive dress to feel beautiful on her wedding day. She only needed him. Adrian wore a black suit, simple and elegant, but on his wrist it wasn't the $1 million watch he usually wore. Instead, it was an old watch, the glass slightly scratched, the leather strap worn with age. It was the watch Harold had given him when he was 15, right before he had to leave with the Cross family. He had kept it for 22 years, and today he wore it as a reminder of where he came from and the people who had loved him when he had nothing. Lily stood at the end of the aisle, her heart racing. She looked ahead to where Adrian was waiting, and she saw him watching her with bright, shining eyes. Then a wrinkled hand closed around hers. Harold stood beside her, wearing an old suit pressed smooth. He would walk her down the aisle, taking the place of the father she no longer had. Harold looked at her, his eyes blurred with tears. He said softly that she had been their daughter since that night. Didn't she know? Since the night she brought 2 elderly strangers back to her tiny apartment. Lily cried. She said, her voice thick, that she knew, sir. They walked together, slowly, down the aisle, laid with white flowers. Margaret sat in the front row, tears already falling. Rachel sat beside her, crying too. Nathan stood beside Adrian, wearing a suit for the first time instead of the black clothes of a bodyguard. And Emma, over a year old, in a small pink dress, sat in Margaret's lap, wide-eyed as she watched her mother come closer. Harold placed Lily's hand into Adrian's, then went down to sit beside Margaret. The two of them looked at each other and held hands tightly. The ceremony began. When it was time to speak their vows, Adrian held Lily's hand and looked straight into her eyes. He said he had once believed he didn't deserve to be loved. He had once believed darkness was where he belonged. And then she appeared at that bus stop night and saved the people he loved most. And she saved him from himself, and he promised he would spend his whole life becoming worthy of her. Lily squeezed his hand, her voice trembling but steady. She said she didn't need him perfect. She didn't need him rich or powerful. She only needed him to try every day, to love Emma as his own child, and to stand beside her when life was hard. Could he do that? Adrian smiled and said he could. They exchanged rings. And when the pastor told him he could kiss the bride, Adrian bent down and kissed Lily gently. Emma clapped and laughed, her clear little laughter filling the small church. Margaret leaned her head on Harold's shoulder and whispered that their abandoned child had finally found a real family. Harold nodded, his eyes wet. He said softly, "And so have we, my dear." 5 years had passed since the wedding day. Their family life had settled into something steady and happy. Adrian had fully legalized Cross Industries, turning it into a respected corporate group. Lily was still a nurse, still loving the work that mattered to her. Emma was 7 now, and they had a 4-year-old son named Daniel, given the name of Lily's first husband. Harold was 79, Margaret 77, and both were still healthy and clear-minded. Then one day, a letter arrived. Kevin Bennett had finished his sentence after 5 years. He wrote to his parents, asking to see them once. The letter was short, only a few crooked lines, but it carried a regret anyone could feel. Harold and Margaret talked it over with Lily and Adrian. The old man sat silent for a long time, staring at the letter in his hand as if it were something foreign. Finally he spoke, his voice weary, and said he didn't know whether he could forgive. Margaret laid her hand over her husband's, her voice gentle but sure. She said he didn't have to forgive completely. He only had to give their son a chance to say he was sorry. He was still their son, no matter what he had done. Harold looked at his wife, then let out a long breath and nodded. A week later, Kevin came. He stood in the doorway, looking nothing like the man from 5 years earlier. Much thinner, hair nearly all gray, even though he was only 50, his face hard and lined. But what had changed most was his eyes. Those eyes no longer held evasion or lies, only a deep, settled remorse. Kevin stepped inside, saw his parents sitting on the sofa, and his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the floor, head bowed low, his voice trembling. He said he wasn't asking them to forgive him. He knew he didn't deserve it. He only wanted to say he was sorry. He was sorry. Harold looked at the son kneeling in front of him. He stayed silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and sad. He asked whether Kevin knew what had happened after he left them at the bus stop. Kevin shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the floor. Harold began to tell him, slowly. He said a stranger had saved them, a young widow with a small child burning with fever. She had nothing, poorer than they were, but she brought them home, gave them her bed, used her last money to call a car for them. Harold went on, his voice catching, and said that woman was his daughter-in-law now. She was Adrian's wife. She had become their daughter. He looked straight at Kevin. He asked if Kevin understood that a stranger had done what their own son would not. Kevin folded over and wept, repeating over and over that he was sorry. He was sorry. He knew he had been wrong. Harold watched his son cry. Then he sighed. He said, tired now, without the old fury, that he didn't know whether he could ever forgive completely, maybe never. But he was 79 now, and he didn't have the strength to hate anymore. He said Kevin could come visit, but he had to rebuild his life himself. No one could do it for him. Kevin nodded again and again, tears still falling. In the months that followed, Kevin began a new life. He worked as a factory laborer, the pay not high but enough to live. He went to treatment for gambling addiction, attended a support group meeting every week. He visited his parents once a month, sitting quietly while they talked, helping Harold with small repairs around the home, eating the meals Margaret cooked. He was never fully forgiven. The wound he had caused was too deep to heal completely. But he was given a chance to apologize, a chance to try, a chance to be with his parents in the final years of their lives. And sometimes, that is all we can ask for. 2 years had passed since Kevin returned. Harold was 81 now, his strength thinning with each season. He no longer moved with the same ease, no longer sat for long stretches on the balcony looking out at the park, no longer told the long stories Emma and Daniel loved, but his eyes still lit up whenever he looked at his family, and his smile was still warm whenever Margaret sat beside him. One autumn morning, Margaret woke and turned to look at her husband the way she always did. But today, something was different. Harold lay completely still, his face strangely peaceful, as if he were smiling in a dream. Margaret lifted her hand and touched his cheek, and she knew. He had gone in his sleep, without pain, without struggle, simply closing his eyes and never opening them again. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She only lay down beside him, held him one last time, and cried in silence. Harold's funeral was held on a cool autumn day. The whole family was there. Lily stood beside Adrian, her hand locked around her husband's. Emma, 9 years old, stood beside her mother, eyes red from crying. Daniel, 6, was still too young to understand everything, but he understood that great-grandpa had gone far away and would never tell him stories again. Kevin came too, standing in the back, quiet and humble. He didn't dare stand close, as if he feared he didn't deserve to be near the family in a moment like this. Margaret held Lily's hand throughout the service. She didn't cry the way people expected. She only looked at her husband's casket with a calm so strange it felt like another kind of grief. When Lily asked if she was all right, Margaret gave a small smile and said he left without pain. That was all she had ever prayed for. After the funeral, the lawyer read Harold's will. The old house in Lincoln Park, the one Adrian had quietly bought back years earlier, was left to Lily and the children. But what broke Adrian open was the handwritten letter Harold left just for him. In the trembling script of an old man, it said that Adrian had paid his debt long ago, from the day he knelt and cried in that apartment, from the day he cared for them like his own parents, and now all he had to do was live happily. That was the only thing Harold wanted. Margaret lived 2 more years after Harold died. She remained sharp-minded, still loving, still cooking good Sunday meals for the family, but everyone could see she was waiting for something. Her eyes often drifted toward the distance, as if searching for someone. She often sat alone in the chair Harold used to sit in, her hand stroking the armrest worn smooth by time. She wasn't sad, but she wasn't whole anymore, either. Half her heart had gone with Harold. One spring evening, Margaret called the whole family to her side. She lay in bed, her face peaceful, as if she already knew what was coming. She took Lily's hand and squeezed gently. She said, weak but still clear, that Lily was the daughter she had always wished for, and she thanked her for saving them that night, thanked her for everything. Then she turned to Adrian and lifted her hand to his cheek. She said she was proud of him. Harold was proud too. The abandoned child from that rainy night had become the finest man she had ever known. Margaret smiled, her eyes brightening in a strange, luminous way. She whispered that she could see Harold now, that he was standing there, that he was still waiting for her. Then she closed her eyes, her breathing grew lighter, and she left in peace. Margaret's funeral was held beside Harold's grave, so they could rest together the way they had lived together for 50 years. The whole family stood around the burial. Lily, Adrian, Emma, Daniel, Kevin, Nathan, Rachel. Strangers 9 years earlier, now a family. As Margaret's casket was lowered, Lily lifted her face to the clear blue sky. She whispered, her voice breaking, "Thank you, for everything." 5 years had passed since the day Margaret left. Lily was 42 now, Adrian 51. Emma had grown into a beautiful, intelligent 16-year-old young woman, and Daniel, 11, was mischievous but kind, just like his father. Cross Industries had become a fully legal and reputable corporation, respected across Chicago's business world. Kevin still visited once a month, still worked as a laborer, still lived simply, and had become an irreplaceable part of their family dinners. One November afternoon, Lily stood alone at the Lincoln Park bus stop, the place where everything began 15 years earlier. She looked at the worn old bench, the faded bus stop sign, and memory surged through her like floodwater. Familiar footsteps sounded behind her. Adrian came to her side and stood with her in silence. He asked what she was thinking about. Lily smiled and said she was thinking about what would have happened if that night she had just gone straight home. Adrian nodded and said then they wouldn't have today. Lily let out a slow breath and said she knew. And that was the most frightening thing, how one small choice had changed everything. Adrian wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. He said softly that it wasn't a small choice. It was her heart. She chose to help when no one forced her to, and that was everything. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who show up when you need them most. It was Harold and Margaret saving a 5-year-old child abandoned in a rainy night. It was Lily stopping to help 2 elderly strangers when she had nothing but her own heart. It was Adrian walking through darkness to protect the people he loved. It was Kevin being given a second chance even after making a mistake that felt impossible to forgive. And it was all of them, choosing each other, every day. Adrian asked, his voice gentle the way it always was with her, whether it had all been worth it. Lily looked into the distance, to where Emma and Daniel were playing in the park, to where their home held a framed photograph of the Bennetts honored on the wall, to where Kevin was helping set the table for dinner. She smiled and said every second of it. This story reminds us that sometimes one small act of kindness can change an entire life, that true family isn't defined by blood, but by love and care, that everyone deserves a second chance if they truly repent, and that happiness doesn't come from money or power, it comes from the people you love and who love you. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with the people you believe deserve to hear it. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever faced a moment when a small decision changed your life? Share with us in the comments below. We truly look forward to hearing what's in the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for staying with us to the end of the story. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and hearts full of love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.